Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm looking to do something a bit different over the next few weeks, and engage with something a bit more theoretical. Some people like that, not for everybody, but anyway. There's a book that I have referenced a couple of times on the podcast, Maoism, A Global History by Julia Lovell. And it's one of the most kind of concise and sort of clear attempts to define this very complicated and sort of diffuse sort of set of ideas rolled into kind of one supposedly coherent ideology. Maoism is really quite unlike and bears very little resemblance to Marxist-Leninism as part of the kind of the family of Marxist ideas. It bears very little resemblance to the works of Marx at all, really. And I believe that Mao had little actual interest in either Marx or Lenin, other than a sort of a beginning point for his ideas. And Julia Lovell sets out the kind of the various sort of strands of Maoist thought. And so I think it's really instructive over the next few weeks to dive into this question of what Maoism actually is. And it's very difficult to define. It is what I would call an insurrectionist ideology. It has less of a historical endpoint that it is working towards, and more of a sense that it is a tool for anti-imperialism. The extent to which Marxist-Leninism really engaged with anti-imperial struggles is debatable, and one could argue that after 1917 there were brief moments in the history of the Soviet Union where anti-imperialist struggle was something that was a priority, but for large parts of the history of the USSR, it really wasn't, and socialism in one country came to define it. But that's a different conversation. So what we're going to do today is in the first of these kind of explorations of Maoism, we're going to look at the beginnings of the chapter by Julia Lovell in Maoism, A Global History. What is Maoism? And Julia Lovell writes, In the first week of January 2016, a vast golden statue of Mao was unveiled in the middle of Henan countryside in central China. Looming out of frozen brown fields under grey skies. Over 36 metres high, it cost £312,000 to build and was paid for by local people and businessmen. For 48 hours, tourists gathered to take selfies with this curious effigy. Apart from the swept-back receding hairline, the statue's head barely resembled Mao. The statue was, word had it, the brainchild of one Mr. Sun Qingxin, a local food processing entrepreneur, crazy for the helmsman. His factory is full of Maos, testified a local potato farmer. Commentators in the Chinese cybersphere had divergent responses. Eternal life to Mao Zedong. He is our legend, our god, we should worship him. Crazy, pull it down. It doesn't look like him. He should have been sitting on a sofa. Use the money to build roads and clinics instead, others argued. Then, on the 7th of January, a black cloth was draped over Mao's head, and the statue was destroyed by public security officials, leaving behind only rubble and rumours that it had violated planning regulations. Even the usually authoritative People's Daily was puzzled by the whole business, confessing that reasons for the demolition are not clear. Several locals wept as the statue came down, among them probably descendants of the multitudes. One analyst put the figure at 7.8 million, who died in Henan during the 1960s famine caused by Mao's policies. The mysterious rise and fall of the Golden Mao, Colossus of Henan, evokes the elusive quality of Mao and Maoism, both in and beyond China. The term Maoism became popular in the 1950s to denote Anglo-American summaries of the system of political thought and practice instituted across the new People's Republic of China. Since then, writes Julia Lovell, it has had a fractious history. Its Chinese translation, Mao Zedong, has never been endorsed by CCP, Chinese Communist Party, ideologues. It is a dismissive term used by liberals to describe adulation for Mao among contemporary China's alt-left, or by government analysts to describe and disavow Maoist policies in India or Nepal today. This group sniffed the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs when protesting the use of the tag by the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, has nothing to do with China, and we feel indignant that they usurp the name of Mao Zedong, the great leader of the Chinese people. Orthodox Chinese analysts use the more liberal, more cerebral term Mao Zedong thought. Yet for all its imperfections, it will be used here because it has become the most commonly used term for the successful Chinese Communist program from the 1930s to the present day. It has validity only on the understanding that the Maoist program, despite possessing a solid symbolic core in the shape of Mao himself, has taken various and often contradictory forms over the decades and continents, according to context. It comes into formal existence in the early 1940s, though built on antecedents from earlier in Mao's life and thought. This chapter, and the subsequent podcasts from it, sets out the core features of the program, as Mao and his later disciples in China and beyond saw them, organizing them in the style of that ubiquitous badge of the high 1960s Maoism, the Little Red Book, by a series of key quotations. It sorts between the derivative and the original in Mao's ideas, where they overlap with and differ from Mao's Soviet predecessors. Some of those differences are in kind, others in degree. In the former category, there is Mao's veneration of the peasantry as a revolutionary force, and his lifelong tenderness for anarchic rebellion against authority. In the latter category belong central elements of the Leninist-Stalinist project, with its veneration of political violence, its championing of anti-colonial resistance, and its use of thought control techniques to forge a disciplined, increasingly repressive party and society. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think, firstly, the idea that Maoism was simply a kind of a hybrid of Marxist-Leninism is probably a little reductive, a little too simplified. It contains various other factors that are born of the kind of the context of Maoist experience, or Mao's personal experience, and the experience of the Chinese Communist Party from the 1930s onwards. And the fact that the Chinese Communist Party, in a way far more so than the Bolsheviks experienced during the Russian Civil War, believed and saw themselves as fighting an anti-colonial struggle. China had effectively been colonized by European powers and by Japan since the 1840s, and continued to be colonized until the late 1940s. And it was only after a victory of the Chinese communists that colonial powers finally left China. And part of the kind of the popularity and part of the magnetism of Mao and the communists was that they would deliver to China the final victory over China's subjugation and humiliation for a century. And so there was always this anti-colonial struggle at the heart of Mao's ideas, and Mao believed that exporting it around the world was the role of Maoism. He also believed that this is how China would come to lead the communist world and eclipse the Soviet Union, by making far more strenuous efforts in Africa and South America and Asia and other places where poor working people toiled on the land. And you have to remember that by 1949, when Mao came to power, a majority of human beings were peasants. It's only been in the last 70 years that there has been this huge transformation away from most people on planet Earth being either smallholders or landless labourers. So Mao saw immense potential in peasant labour and peasant revolution. Mao also saw that or believed that institutions that were allowed to simply establish themselves and continue without endless kind of upheaval and revolt would atrophy into kind of something approximating capitalism in the end. And this, in a way, was part of the explanation for the later Cultural Revolution. I mean, the other part of the explanation is Mao's desire to continue to be relevant and Mao's desire for revenge. So in order for us to understand the first point of Julia Lovell's summary of Marxist-Leninist thought, the famous aphorism, "Power comes from the barrel of a gun," we have to go back to the purge of the communists by the nationalists in Shanghai on the 12th of April 1927. At 4 a.m, a bugle call from the headquarters of the Nationalist Party on Route Gizhi in the far south of the French concession was answered by the siren from a gunboat moored on the city's east side. Members of Shanghai's most powerful triad, the Green Gang, disguised in blue factory workers' uniforms and with white armbands, converged on communist strongholds scattered through the low-rise Chinese quarters of the city. Sunrise was still an hour and a half away when machine gun fire rattled through the darkness. Every worker who resisted was shot down. Others were lashed together and marched away for execution. A general strike was called for the following day, but those who turned out for protest demonstration were brought down by nationalist machine gun fire, rifle butts and bayonets. The protesters had put women and children at the front of the march, assuming that nationalist troops would not open fire. More than 300 were killed that day, witnesses reckoned, and a far larger number wounded, some of whom were buried alive with the dead. 3 weeks earlier, communist prospects in the city had looked very different. In the last 10 days of March, Shanghai's warlord ruler had surrendered the metropolis to a coalition of armed pickets and organized by the young Chinese Communist Party. Strikers had first shut down the city and then, initially armed with only 100 rifles, 250 pistols, and 200 hand grenades, plus propaganda leaflets, posters, and newspapers, had fought for shipyards, police stations, and railways. The taking of the city was crucial to the uprising launched in 1926, the so-called Northern Exposition, China's second revolution in 15 years, against army strongmen who had carved the country into regional kingdoms. The 1911 revolution was brought to an end some 2,000 years of dynastic rule. Within 5 years, the central authority had disintegrated with the rise of warlords and provincial commanders. The young republic still had a president in the capital Beijing, but his authority over the localities was normal. Nonetheless, faith in the idea of a unified China persisted. Urban China, periodically erupted with discontent at the new status quo. For political paralysis and a fragmented military rule made China domestically and internationally vulnerable. On the 4th of May 1919, patriotic protests in Beijing and Shanghai broke out after China's warlord rulers agreed at the Versailles Conference to sign away a large slice of northeast China to Japan. By 1923, Sun Yat-sen, the Republic's first briefly incumbent president, and a man obsessed with the idea of reunifying China, forged an alliance between his Nationalist Party and the Communists, all funded, trained and armed by the Soviet Union and its Communist International. Sun's death in 1925 notwithstanding, his successor as nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, launched the Northern Expedition, a military campaign to reunite the country the following year. Soviet-trained Chinese troops pushed up from the south, fighting, bribing warlords into submission. The forces were a united front of the conservative GMD and the more radical CCP. The GMD, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, the GMD controlled the formal standing army, but everywhere they fought, their task was made easier by striking workers and peasant activists organised by the communists, who disrupted the communications, material and authority of the old regime. So, part of Mao's kind of political education is in the sort of like the bloody ferment of the 1920s and 30s that saw competing factors. Warlords, the Kuomintang, the Communist Party and the Japanese all try to kind of outmaneuver one another. And one of the powers that in this battle that seems to be more likely to succeed is actually the nationalists. And the communists learn about nationalist repression firsthand. They form an alliance in 1926 and then are betrayed in 1927. This was an uneasy alliance. The aims and the power base of the two parties were fundamentally at odds, and the GMD had always relied, this is the Kuomintang, had always relied on the money classes for funds, while the communists were devoted to organising rebellion by China's urban workers and poor farmers. Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the nationalists, marched into the labour unions at and to Shanghai's foreigners, made a secret deal with Shanghai's Green Gang leader-in-chief, Du Yusheng, to break the city's communists. Then on the 11th of April, Du invited Wang Shuhua, the communist leader of the General Labour Union, to a quiet dinner in his French-style villa, where one of Du's Green Gang underlings strangled him. A few hours later, early on the 12th of April, Du's thugs, paid and armed by Chinese and foreign businessmen, eliminated the unsuspecting, unprepared communist strongholds throughout the city. So there's nothing quite like the machinations of the capitalist classes to inform and educate revolutionaries on how to do revolution. And every time that someone like Lenin or Stalin or Mao ever wondered whether in fact Marx had been sort of slightly off beam in his views of the counter-revolutionary potential of the bourgeoisie or other capitalist classes, you only have to look to moments like 1927, where the nationalists, in cahoots with gangsters, paid by Chinese business, acts, ruthlessly, violently, and brutally to eliminate the communists, the trade unions, and the left in general. Now, obviously, when Mao comes to power, this idea of power coming from the barrel of a gun, this is Mao's education. Mao realizes, much as Lenin realizes, that instead of dissolving the state, you want to keep it and reverse what it does. You need to have the state to wage war on your idea of who the enemy classes are. The bourgeoisie, intellectuals, like that kind of thing, wealthy peasants, landowners. Lenin, in State and Revolution, really concludes this. He says, previous to this, there had been all sorts of very kind of almost anarcho-syndicalist ideas within the Bolsheviks about, abolishing the state and getting rid of private ownership and watching everything wither away, and then letting people kind of get on with it. By 1918, Lenin doesn't believe this anymore. And by the mid-1920s, 1930s, Mao certainly doesn't believe it, if he ever did. And what he does believe, and what Lenin came to believe, is that the state can actually be exceedingly handy, and that transformation had to happen with violence. You can't have a revolution without it. The sort of transformation that we are talking of, the social and economic transformation of China, the elimination of the landlord class, the redistribution of land and the collectivization and the communalization of land, the transference of wealth from rural to industrial, and the change from China from a kind of a nationalist republic to a Maoist one-party state needed violence in order to make that occur. And you need for that a large, centralized, bureaucratized, violent state willing to do the violence that you ask of it. So our first principle, we'll leave that in just a moment. Our first principle is about the idea that the origins of power come from coercion, and that power itself doesn't have any other means of creating it. This seems kind of fairly sort of obvious stuff, but I think the kind of the degree of violence, I mean the extraordinary violence that existed in China between, say, 1927 and 1949, and in the decades afterwards, of course, really did inform people like Mao, who saw themselves as fighting this sort of like the forever war. Here's a final thought. Of all the lessons learned by the Chinese Communist Party in its history, the one taught by the bloody spring of 1927 left arguably the deepest impression. To stand a chance of survival, the party needed an army. In 1927, Mao Zedong, one of several party leaders who began to endorse violence at the time, turned the moral of the tale into his best-known aphorism, the one that subsequently migrated from Chinese propaganda posters to Black Panther flyers, from hand-copied Parisian student rags to Indian jungle rallies. Political power comes from the barrel of a gun. 11 years later, he added the crucial refinement: the party commands the gun, and the gun must never be allowed to command the party. This affection for political violence underpinned the cult that Mao would create over the next half-century. In the context of the modern political movements, respect for the power of the gun was not remotely exceptional. Indeed, fascism celebrated violence more rapidly than communism. But within Chinese communism, Mao's rhetorical intervention was decisive. Okay, so we'll leave that for there. We'll return to Julia Lovell next week and look at some more of that. I just want to say thanks to everyone for listening this week. As you can see, we're really focusing a lot on trying to get an episode out every day to really kind of keep that momentum going. I hope you find this useful. Would love your feedback, so please always feel free to message me. You can find me at Nick Shepley on Twitter, or you can send me a message at nick_shepley@hotmail.com. And if you have any questions or anything you need, or you just want to chat, I'm always there. It's a pleasure to be able to do this for you guys. Thanks very much, and join us on the next Explaining History podcast.